September 17, 1944. The sky over England darkened with the largest armada of transport aircraft ever assembled in human history. Over 4,000 aircraft and gliders carrying 35,000 airborne troops, artillery pieces and jeeps roared toward the continent. The target was a 64-mile highway slicing straight through the German-occupied Netherlands. The objective was the Rhine River. The promise was that the boys would be home by Christmas. It was supposed to be a masterstroke, a dagger thrust right into the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Instead, it became a meat grinder. Welcome back to the channel. We dissect the friction of war, the raw mechanics of combat, and the tactical decisions that build empires or dig graves. Today, we are looking at Operation Market Garden. I want to ask you a question before we get into the weeds. Do you think a narrow, single-highway offensive relying on lightly armed paratroopers holding bridges for heavy armor was a bold stroke of genius, or a fundamentally flawed suicide mission? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to keep studying the hard truths of military history with us, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. By late August 1944, the Allied war machine was a victim of its own catastrophic success. Following the breakout from the Normandy beachheads in Operation Cobra, American and British armoured columns had shattered the German 7th Army at the Falaise Pocket. They had sprinted across France, covering hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. But modern mechanized warfare is a slave to a very unglamorous master, and that master is logistics. Every Sherman tank, every 2.5-ton truck, and every infantryman required an endless river of fuel, ammunition, and rations. The Allies were consuming over 1 million gallons of gasoline a day. The problem was the ports. The major deep-water ports like Cherbourg were hundreds of miles behind the front lines, and the retreating Germans had systematically destroyed the port facilities. The famous Red Ball Express, a massive convoy system driven largely by American quartermaster troops, was running itself ragged trying to push supplies forward. Trucks were burning more fuel just driving to the front than they were actually delivering. The Allied advance was quite literally running out of gas. We have seen this logistical death spiral before in American history. Look back to the American Civil War, specifically the Gettysburg Campaign. General Robert E. Lee pushed the Army of Northern Virginia deep into Union territory, stretching his supply lines to the breaking point. When you operate that far from your base of supply, your strategic options shrink down to a pinpoint. You are forced to forage. You are forced into decisive engagements before you are ready, and when the momentum stops, the collapse is rapid. The Allies in the fall of 1944 were facing a similar crisis of momentum. The broad front strategy championed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower meant distributing the dwindling trickle of supplies across all the Allied armies from the Swiss border to the English Channel. Enter Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding the British 21st Army Group in the north. Montgomery was a cautious, methodical commander, deeply scarred by the massive infantry casualties of the First World War. Yet, in September 1944, he proposed a gamble so reckless it seemed completely out of character. He wanted Eisenhower to halt General George S. Patton's Third Army in the south, divert all available supplies to his 21st Army Group, and allow him to launch a single concentrate armoured thrust through the Netherlands across the Rhine, and straight into the Ruhr Valley, the industrial beating heart of Germany. Patton was furious. His tanks were crossing the Moselle River, and he famously declared that his men could eat their belts, but his tanks needed gas. Montgomery argued his narrow thrust would bypass the heavily fortified Siegfried Line and end the war by December. Eisenhower, desperate to maintain momentum and facing immense political pressure from London, to utilize the newly formed 1st Allied Airborne Army, bought into the plan. Why would a supreme commander like Eisenhower, known for his diplomatic balancing act and conservative broad front approach, suddenly sign off on a risky, single-axis penetration? The answer lies in the illusion of a defeated enemy. Allied intelligence, in September 1944, suffered from a lethal case of victory disease. They believed the Wehrmacht was completely broken. They saw disorganized columns of retreating German soldiers, shattered panzer divisions, and prisoners surrendering by the thousands. The assessment was that the German army was a hollow shell, incapable of mounting a cohesive defense, let alone a coordinated counterattack. This was a fatal miscalculation. The German soldier, fighting for his homeland, backed into a corner, was a fundamentally different animal than the German soldier occupying France. To understand the mechanics of Market Garden, we have to look at the evolution of airborne doctrine. The concept of vertical envelopment was born in the interwar years. American visionary Billy Mitchell had proposed dropping troops by parachute behind enemy lines as early as 1918. But it was the Germans who first proved the concept on a grand scale. We must look at the German invasion of Crete in 1941. Operation Mercury was a strategic victory for the German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, but it came at a horrific cost. The sky, filled with slow-moving transport planes, became a shooting gallery for Allied anti-aircraft fire. The German paratroopers took such catastrophic casualties that Adolf Hitler forbade large-scale airborne operations for the rest of the war. The Allies looked at Crete and learned a different lesson. They believed that with massive air superiority, better transport aircraft, and heavier glider-borne equipment, vertical envelopment could shatter an enemy's rear area. This led to the creation of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, commanded by American Lieutenant General Lewis H. Brereton. Brereton was an aviator, not an infantryman. He looked at the map of Holland not through the eyes of a ground commander assessing terrain, but through the eyes of a pilot looking for drop zones. The plan was split into two parts. Market was the airborne assault. Garden was the ground offensive. The airborne component was staggering. 3 complete airborne divisions and a Polish parachute brigade were tasked with securing a series of bridges along a 64-mile corridor. In the south, the American 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles, under the command of Major General Maxwell Taylor, was assigned the bridges around Eindhoven. North of them, the American 82nd Airborne Division The All-Americans, led by the aggressive Brigadier General James Gavin, was tasked with the heavily defended bridges at Nijmegen, including the massive bridge over the Waal River. And at the very tip of the spear, the furthest drop zone, was the British 1st Airborne Division, under Major General Roy Urquhart, alongside Major General Stanislaus Sosabowski's 1st Polish Parachute Brigade. Their objective was the bridge over the Lower Rhine at a picturesque Dutch town called Arnhem. Let us talk about how you actually deliver 35,000 men behind enemy lines. The workhorse of this operation was the Douglas C-47 Skytrain. This aircraft was a marvel of American industrial capacity. Powered by two Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp radial engines, each pumping out 1,200 horsepower, the C-47 could carry 28 fully equipped paratroopers, or up to 6,000 pounds of cargo. It had a cruising speed of 160 miles per hour. But paratroopers alone cannot hold ground against heavy armor. They needed vehicles, artillery, and anti-tank guns. For this, the Allies relied on gliders, specifically the American Waco CG-4A and the massive British airspeed Horsa. The Horsa was built largely of wood and could carry a jeep, a 75mm pack howitzer, or 25 troops. Glider pilots were a special breed. They flew unarmored, unpowered wooden boxes into combat zones, knowing their landing would essentially be a controlled crash into a Dutch farmer's field. The Garden component fell to the British XX Corps, commanded by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks. XX Corps was an armoured battering ram. Their vanguard was the Guards Armoured Division, equipped primarily with American-built M4 Sherman tanks and British Cromwell tanks. The standard Sherman, with its 75mm gun, was reliable and mechanically sound, but it was outgunned by heavy German armour. To counter this, the British fielded the Sherman Firefly. They took the standard Sherman chassis and crammed a massive 17-pounder anti-tank gun into the turret. The 17-pounder was a high-velocity killer capable of punching through the frontal armour of a German Tiger tank at 1,000 yards. But XX Corps had a fundamental geographic problem. They had to drive 64 miles up a single elevated two-lane highway. The Dutch countryside on either side of this road, known as the polder, was reclaimed swampland. It was soft, boggy, and crisscrossed by deep drainage ditches. If a 30-ton tank rolled off the paved road, it would sink to its bellypan in the mud. Think about the tactical nightmare of moving an entire armoured corps up a single road. What happens when the lead tank hits a mine or takes an 88mm shell through the front armour? The entire column stops. This geographic bottleneck is reminiscent of the Roman legions being ambushed in the Teutoburg forest. When a mechanized or heavily equipped force is strung out in a long, narrow column with no room to deploy into a line of battle, their numerical superiority evaporates. They can only fight with the first few vehicles in the column. The rest are just targets waiting in a massive traffic jam. Now, let us look at the men waiting for them. The Allied intelligence assessment that the German army in the Netherlands was broken was a catastrophic failure of imagination. Command of the German forces in the region, Army Group B, had just been handed to Field Marshal Walter Model. Model was known as the fireman of the Eastern Front. He was a master of defensive warfare, a brutal, energetic commander who excelled at scraping together shattered units and forging them into a cohesive defensive line. Model was not sitting in a bunker in Berlin. He was on the ground in the Netherlands, actively reorganizing his forces. The true strength of the Wehrmacht in late 1944 was not in its grand formations, but in its underlying tactical doctrine. The Germans perfected the concept of the Kampfgruppe, or battle group. When a division was shattered, the survivors did not just wander aimlessly. German officers and non-commissioned officers were trained to take whatever men, weapons, and vehicles were available. They would take cooks, mechanics, anti-aircraft gunners, and a couple of surviving tanks, and instantly form them into a combined arms team. They were highly decentralized and incredibly lethal. If you want a modern equivalent, look at the modularity of a United States Marine Corps Marine Air-Ground Task Force. The ability to scale a fighting force up or down, combining infantry, armor, and air assets on the fly to meet the specific needs of the mission, is a cornerstone of modern American military operations. The Germans were executing a desperate ad hoc version of this in the fall of 1944. And then there was the armor. Unbeknownst to Allied planners, the 2 SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Wilhelm Bittrich, had been pulled out of the line and sent to the Arnhem area to refit. This corps consisted of the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg. While these divisions were heavily depleted from the fighting in Normandy, a depleted SS Panzer Division was still a terrifying force. They possessed Panther tanks. The Panther, weighing nearly 50 tons, was armed with a lethal 75mm gun that could destroy any Allied tank on the battlefield long before the Allied tank got into its own firing range. The Panther's thick, sloped frontal armor made it nearly impervious to frontal fire from a standard Sherman. The Germans also had elements equipped with the fearsome Tiger tanks and the legendary 88mm flak gun. The 88mm was originally designed to shoot down bombers, but the Germans figured out that its high muzzle velocity and flat trajectory made it the ultimate anti-tank sniper rifle. The presence of these panzer divisions was not entirely a secret. Dutch resistance fighters, utilizing a clandestine network of telephone lines, sent frantic reports to London detailing the arrival of heavy German armor in the Arnhem area. Major Brian Urquhart, an intelligence officer for the British 1st Airborne Division, even ordered a low-level aerial reconnaissance flight. The photographs clearly showed German tanks hidden under camouflage netting in the woods around Arnhem. When Urquhart presented these photos to his superiors, he was dismissed. He was told the tanks were likely broken down or dummy vehicles. The momentum of the operation was too great to stop. The planners had fallen in love with their own plan. A classic case of confirmation bias, where any intelligence contradicting the desired outcome was simply ignored. The stage was set. 35,000 lightly armed paratroopers were about to jump into the hornet's nest, expecting to fight old men and boys. An armored corps was preparing to drive up a 64-mile bowling alley surrounded by mud. The weather over the English Channel was beginning to shift, bringing in a low cloud ceiling that would threaten the vital aerial resupply missions. The intelligence was flawed, the logistics were stretched to the absolute limit, and Field Marshal Model was waiting. The ramps of the C-47s were about to drop, and the greatest airborne gamble in military history was about to collide violently with the brutal reality of German steel. The green light flashed inside the fuselage of the C-47s, and the sky over the Netherlands instantly filled with thousands of blossoming silk canopies. Stepping out of a transport plane flying at 150 miles per hour, merely 600 feet off the ground, is an act of unnatural violence. The American and British paratroopers were using the standard round parachutes of the era, like the American T-7 assembly. These were not modern, steerable square canopies that allow a soft, precision landing. They were unsteerable umbrellas that dropped a combat-loaded soldier at roughly 22 feet per second. When the static line yanked the deployment bag off the canopy, the opening shock was so brutal. It routinely snapped the straps of heavy equipment bags strapped to the troopers' legs, sending radios, mortar baseplates, and medical supplies plunging into the Dutch swamps. They hit the ground hard, rolled, shed their harnesses, and immediately prepared to fight. But a paratrooper on the ground is just lightly armed infantry, and their survival depends entirely on the weapons they carry on their backs and the speed at which they can assemble. The standard American infantryman was armed with the M1 Garand, a gas-operated, semi-automatic masterpiece firing a heavy .30 caliber round from an 8-round N-block clip. It provided a massive advantage in rate of fire over the standard German infantry rifle, the bolt-action Karabiner 98K. However, the true king of the World War II battlefield was the machine gun, and here the Germans held a terrifying trump card. The MG-42, known to the Americans as Hitler's buzzsaw, was a recoil-operated machine gun that fired at a staggering rate of 1,200 rounds per minute. It did not sound like a gun firing individual bullets. It sounded like canvas tearing. A single German squad, built around an MG-42, could pin down an entire airborne company if they caught them in the open. How do you fight a heavily entrenched, mechanized enemy when your heaviest weapon is a spring-loaded tube? That was the reality for the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem. Their primary anti-tank weapon was the PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank. It was a crude, heavy, spring-loaded spigot mortar that fired a shaped charge. It had a maximum effective range of maybe 100 yards, and cocking the massive internal spring required a man to stand up and pull, with all his back strength, a suicidal maneuver in a firefight. The Germans, conversely, were fielding the Panzerfaust, a cheap, single-use, pre-loaded shaped charge that could punch through 8 inches of steel armor. Every German baker, clerk, and mechanic in Arnhem seemed to have one. The friction of war set in before the last parachute hit the ground. For Major General Roy Urquhart and his British 1st Airborne Division in the north, the plan began to unravel immediately due to a catastrophic failure in terrain analysis and risk assessment. Royal Air Force commanders, terrified of German anti-aircraft flak batteries near the Arnhem Bridge, refused to drop the paratroopers close to the objective. Instead, they selected drop zones 6 to 8 miles away, in the open heaths around Wolfhees. What happens when an elite light infantry force loses the element of surprise and is forced to march 8 miles through heavily defended urban terrain? You lose the initiative, and in airborne operations, initiative is your only armor. This blunder mirrors the British amphibious landings at Gallipoli during the First World War. By landing too far from the high ground and failing to push inland immediately, the British at Gallipoli gave the Ottoman forces time to dig in and turn the peninsula into a slaughterhouse. At Arnhem, the 8-mile march gave Field Marshal Walter Model and the 2 SS Panzer Corps the exact thing they needed most, which was time. As Urquhart's men began their march toward the bridge, they walked straight into a blocking line, hastily assembled by SS Major Sepp Kraft, who commanded an SS training and replacement battalion. Kraft did not have a massive force, but he understood terrain. He deployed his men in the dense woods along the primary routes to the bridge, utilizing mortars and MG-42s to create a deadly gauntlet. To make matters worse, the British command and control structure completely evaporated. The British were equipped with the Type 22 radio set. These radios were designed for line-of-sight communication in the open deserts of North Africa. In the dense, tree-lined suburbs of Arnhem, surrounded by iron-rich soil, the radio waves simply bounced back. Furthermore, somebody in the logistics chain had failed to properly match the crystal frequencies, meaning the ground troops could not talk to the fighter bombers orbiting helplessly overhead. Urquhart was effectively commanding a division, deaf, dumb, and blind. Can you imagine the psychological toll of watching your only lifeline to the outside world shatter on the ground, knowing you are surrounded by enemy armor with no way to call for help? This total communication blackout is eerily similar to the fate of the American Lost Battalion in the Argonne Forest during World War I. Major Charles, Whittlesey's men, pushed ahead of their flanks, lost communication with headquarters, and were surrounded by German forces, suffering horrific casualties, while their own artillery accidentally shelled them. Urquhart's division was rapidly becoming the lost battalion of the Second World War. Despite the chaos, one British unit broke through. The 2nd Parachute Battalion, commanded by the legendary Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, managed to slip south along the riverbank, bypassing Kraft's blocking line. Frost was a hardened veteran of airborne operations in North Africa and Sicily. He carried a hunting horn into battle and led from the absolute front. By the evening of September 17, Frost's battalion, numbering roughly 740 men, reached the northern end of the massive Arnhem road bridge. They immediately occupied the houses overlooking the ramp. But when they tried to cross to secure the southern end, they were met by blistering fire from a German pillbox and an armoured car. Frost was stuck on the north side, but he held the choke point. No German traffic could cross that bridge. Now, all Frost had to do was hold out for 2 days until the British Exedenx Corps arrived. Down south, the garden component of the operation was violently waking up to the reality of Hell's Highway. At exactly 1400 hours, XXX Corps artillery opened up with a rolling barrage, a creeping wall of high explosives designed to shatter the German front line. Behind this wall of fire, the Irish Guards' Armoured Division rolled forward. The lead tanks were Sherman Fireflies, their long 17-pounder guns scanning the tree lines. But the Germans were waiting. As the British armour crossed into the Netherlands, German infantry hidden in the ditches flanking the elevated road stood up and unleashed a volley of Panzerfausts. In less than 2 minutes, 9 British tanks were transformed into burning steel coffins. If your entire armoured thrust relies on a single paved road, and the enemy knows exactly where that road goes, are you driving an offensive, or are you driving into a kill zone? The destruction of the lead tanks completely blocked the highway. The entire XX Corps, tens of thousands of men and vehicles, ground to a halt. Bulldozer tanks had to be brought up from the rear, pushing the burning Shermans off the steep embankments just to clear a path. This cost them hours, and in Operation Market Garden, hours were paid for in airborne blood. Further up the corridor, the American 101st Airborne Division under Major General Maxwell Taylor had successfully secured the town of Veghel, but they faced a disaster at Sun. As the paratroopers rushed the bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal, the German defenders detonated rigged explosives. The bridge blew up right in the faces of the Americans. This was the nightmare scenario. XX Corps could not cross thin air. Taylor immediately ordered his engineers forward. They had to construct a Bailey Bridge. The Bailey Bridge was a brilliant piece of British military engineering. It was a prefabricated modular steel truss bridge that could be assembled by hand, using steel pins, without the need for heavy cranes. But building a heavy steel bridge capable of supporting 30-ton tanks takes time. The 101st Airborne worked through the night under sporadic German mortar fire. But XX Corps was now mathematically behind schedule, and the clock was ticking down on John Frost at Arnhem. In the center of the corridor, the American 82nd Airborne Division was fighting a desperate two-front battle. Brigadier General James Gavin, the youngest Major General to command a division in World War II, had dropped his men onto the Oosterbeek Heights. This was a critical piece of high ground dominating the area southeast of Nijmegen. Gavin knew that if the Germans counterattacked out of the nearby Reichswald forest, they would use the heights to crush his division and sever the highway. So, Gavin prioritized defending the high ground over immediately rushing the primary objective, the massive road bridge over the Waal River in Nijmegen. This tactical decision remains one of the most hotly debated choices of the entire war. By the time Gavin's men secured the heights and pushed into Nijmegen, the Germans had reinforced the bridge with SS troops and heavy 88mm anti-aircraft guns depressed to fire horizontally. The 82nd Airborne hit a brick wall of German steel. By day 2 and 3, September 18 and 19, the weather over the English Channel collapsed. A dense fog grounded the Allied transport planes. The crucial second lift, which was supposed to bring in the rest of the airborne infantry, artillery, and vitally needed ammunition, was delayed. The men on the ground were now fighting a heavily mechanized enemy with dwindling supplies. Back at Arnhem, the situation for John Frost's battalion at the bridge was becoming apocalyptic. Field Marshal Model ordered the 9th SS Panzer Division to clear the bridge. On the morning of September 18, the 9th SS Reconnaissance Battalion, commanded by Captain Paul Grebner, attempted to rush the bridge from south to north. Grebner commanded a column of 22 armoured half-tracks and scout cars. He assumed the lightly armed British paratroopers would break under the sheer shock of an armoured charge. He was dead wrong. As the German column sped across the bridge, Frost's men waited until the lead vehicles were halfway across the span. Then they unleashed hell. British 6-pounder anti-tank guns, hidden in the ruins of the houses, slammed high-velocity armour-piercing rounds into the German half-tracks. Pi-8T bombs arced from the rooftops, punching through the thin top armour of the vehicles. Bren machine guns and Lee Enfield rifles targeted the exposed German infantry in the open-topped transports. The bridge became a slaughterhouse. Vehicles collided, burned, and blocked the roadway. German soldiers desperately tried to bail out, only to be cut down by crossfire. In less than 2 hours, Grebner was dead, and his entire battalion was essentially annihilated. 12 burning hulks littered the bridge. Frost had held, but his ammunition was running critically low, and the houses his men occupied were being systematically reduced to rubble by German tank fire. The sheer brutality of the urban combat at the Arnhem Bridge is hard to overstate. The Germans realized that pushing infantry into the houses was too costly, so they brought up Tiger tanks and self-propelled artillery. They simply parked 200 yards away and fired high-explosive shells directly through the windows of the British positions. Buildings collapsed, burying wounded paratroopers in the cellars. The British fought from room to room, throwing grenades down stairwells, using bayonets and entrenching tools when the ammunition ran dry. Down at Nijmegen, the situation reached a boiling point on September 20. XXX Corps had finally linked up with the 82nd Airborne, but the Nijmegen Bridge was still firmly in German hands, heavily defended by dug-in infantry and anti-tank guns. General Gavin and General Horrocks realized that a frontal assault across the bridge was suicide. They needed to outflank the defenders. Gavin proposed a plan of sheer, unadulterated madness. He ordered the 3rd Battalion of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment, commanded by Major Julian Cook, to cross the Waal River in boats, assault the northern bank, and take the bridge from behind. If you are an American paratrooper, trained to drop from the sky and fight her on land, why are you suddenly fighting as an amphibious assault force in a canvas bathtub? The boats provided by the British engineers were Mark III assault boats. They were 19 feet long, made of nothing but canvas stretched over a wooden frame, and weighed over 300 pounds. They offered zero ballistic protection. A bullet would pass clean through both sides. The American paratroopers had to carry these massive canvas targets on their shoulders, sprint across a flat, muddy floodplain devoid of cover, and paddle across 400 yards of fast-flowing water. This river crossing is reminiscent of the horrific amphibious assault at Tarawa in the Pacific Theater, where Marines were forced to wade through chest-deep water under relentless machine gun fire. At 1500 hours, under a massive smokescreen that quickly blew away in the wind, Major Cook and his men launched their boats. The moment they hit the water, the German defenders on the north bank opened fire. 88mm airburst shells exploded above the river, showering the fragile boats with razor-sharp shrapnel. MG-42 tracer rounds ripped across the surface of the water, tearing through canvas, wood, and human flesh. Would you paddle a canvas boat across 400 yards of open water while heavy artillery shells tear your friends in half? The paratroopers did not have enough paddles, so men were using the butts of their M1 Garons to row. Boats sank. Men drowned under the weight of their combat gear. But they kept paddling. Out of the 26 boats in the first wave, only 11 made it to the far shore. When the surviving Americans hit the mud of the North Bank, they were consumed by a primal rage. They did not wait for orders. They charged straight up the embankments, fixing bayonets, and engaged the German defenders in brutal hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. They cleared the northern end of the bridge, securing the objective at a horrific cost in American lives. The Nijmegen Bridge was finally open. The tanks of Sechsenkt Corps rolled across the massive span, the crews looking down at the bodies of the American paratroopers floating in the river below. The road to Arnhem was theoretically clear. They were only 10 miles away from John Frost. But modern armoured warfare is never that simple, and the terrain of the Netherlands was about to dictate the final, bloody chapter of this campaign. The tanks had crossed the river, but they were now rolling onto a narrow causeway known as the Island, completely exposed, with German panzers moving in for the kill, and the radio silence from Arnhem growing more ominous by the minute. The vanguard of the Irish Guards Armoured Division rolled off the northern ramp of the Nijmegen Bridge and onto a stretch of terrain known locally as the Betuig. But, to the Allied soldiers, it was simply called the Island. It was the afternoon of September 20. The sky was darkening, and the road to Arnhem, a mere 10 miles away, lay open before them. Yet the tanks ground to a halt. The engines idled, the crews dismounted, and they brewed tea. Why would the vanguard of a massive armoured thrust stop when the ultimate objective, where thousands of British paratroopers were fighting for their lives, was only 10 miles away? The British commanders argued that the terrain was unsuitable for an unsupported armoured advance. The island was a flat, featureless polder reclaimed from the swamps. The road was built on a steep dike, elevated above the surrounding bogs. A tank driving on that road was silhouetted against the sky, a perfect target for any German anti-tank gun hidden in the distant tree lines. They demanded infantry support to clear the flanks before moving forward. This paralyzing caution is a recurring nightmare in military history. Look at Union General George B. McClellan at the Battle of Antietam in 1862. McClellan had a massive numerical advantage and had even captured Confederate General Robert E. Lee's detailed battle plans wrapped around 3 cigars. Yet McClellan hesitated, convinced he was outnumbered, refusing to commit his reserves and allowing Lee's army to survive and fight another day. General Brian Horrocks and the commanders of the XXX Corps exhibited that exact same fatal hesitation. In armoured warfare, speed is security. By stopping to wait for the infantry of the 43rd Wessex Division, which was trapped in the mother of all traffic jams, miles behind them on Hell's Highway, the British threw away the only chance they had to relieve Arnhem. Every minute they sat on the island, German Field Marshal Walter Model was rushing anti-tank screens into the 10-mile gap. 10 miles to the north, the concept of time had lost all meaning for Lieutenant Colonel John Frost and the 2nd Parachute Battalion. It was September 21, day 5 of a mission they were told would last 2 days. The northern end of the Arnhem Bridge had been reduced to a smouldering, apocalyptic wasteland. The British paratroopers were out of anti-tank ammunition, out of rations, and critically, out of water. They were tapping the radiators of destroyed jeeps just to get rust-filled water to drink. The German 2 SS Panzer Corps had stopped trying to assault the houses with infantry. Instead, they brought up the heavy armour. Tiger Eye tanks weighing 54 tons and armed with the devastating 88mm gun simply drove down the street and systematically levelled the British positions block by block. They would fire high explosive shells point blank into the ground floors, collapsing the structures onto the defenders. The cellars were packed with hundreds of wounded men. When a building caught fire, the able-bodied paratroopers had to frantically drag the wounded through the rubble to another burning building. This was not a battle of manoeuvre anymore. It was a desperate, static slaughter. It was the modern equivalent of the Alamo in 1836. Just like William B. Travis, Davy Crockett, and the Texan defenders who were surrounded by Santa Anna's massive Mexican army, the British paratroopers at the bridge knew no relief column was coming. They were completely isolated, vastly outgunned, fighting with captured German weapons and bayonets, buying time with their blood. Frost himself was severely wounded in the legs by a mortar blast. By the evening of September 21, the last pockets of resistance at the bridge were finally overrun. The Germans took the surviving, exhausted paratroopers prisoner. The Arnhem Bridge was back in German hands, and the door to the Rhine was slammed shut. With the bridge lost, the remainder of the British 1st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Roy Urquhart, was pushed into a tight, horseshoe-shaped defensive perimeter in the wealthy wooded suburb of Oosterbeek, west of Arnhem. The base of this perimeter rested on the northern bank of the lower Rhine. They called it the Cauldron. The Germans subjected the Oosterbeek pocket to relentless, punishing artillery bombardments. The psychological toll of this shelling was magnified by the German use of the Nebelwerfer. This was a multiple rocket launcher that fired 150mm or 210mm rockets. The rockets were designed with the exhaust nozzles angled to impart spin, which created a terrifying, shrieking howl as they flew through the air. The Allied troops called them moaning minis. The sound alone was enough to shatter the nerves of men who had not slept in a week. Inside the Oosterbeek perimeter, the logistical situation transformed into a dark, tragic comedy of errors. The paratroopers desperately needed ammunition and medical supplies. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces launched massive aerial resupply missions, flying heavy short Stirling and Douglas C-47 bombers through curtains of German flak to drop supplies. But the drop zones had been pre-planned in London days before the operation began. The planners assumed the British would control wide swathes of territory. They did not. The Germans controlled the drop zones. The British troops lying in their shallow trenches watched in absolute agony as hundreds of brightly coloured parachutes carrying food, morphine, and .30 caliber ammunition drifted gracefully right into the German lines. The ground troops tried to lay out fluorescent signal panels to wave off the pilots, but the air crews, strictly following their pre-flight briefings and flying through intense anti-aircraft fire, ignored the ground signals. You can possess the greatest industrial manufacturing base on the planet, churning out millions of K rations and artillery shells. But if your delivery mechanism is rigid, inflexible, and blind to the tactical reality on the ground, you are simply operating a very expensive supply service for the enemy. The tragedy deepened on September 21, when the weather finally cleared enough to allow the drop of the 1st Polish Parachute Brigade. Their commander, Major General Stanislaw Sosabowski, was a brilliant, pragmatic officer who had openly criticized the Market Garden Plan from the very beginning, recognizing the fatal flaws in the airborne drop zones and the single-road axis of advance. His reward for being right was to lead his men into a meat grinder. The Polish paratroopers were dropped on the southern bank of the Rhine, near the village of Driel. Their objective was to cross the river and reinforce the collapsing Oosterbeek pocket on the north bank. But when they arrived at the river, the Driel ferry, their only means of crossing heavy equipment, had been destroyed. They were stranded on the flat southern bank, completely exposed to heavy German machine gun and mortar fire pouring down from the elevated high ground on the northern shore. Over the next 2 nights, the Polish troops attempted desperate, suicidal crossings in small inflatable rubber dinghies, paddling frantically with their rifle butts under the glare of German flares. Hundreds of Polish soldiers, men who had escaped Nazi-occupied Poland to fight for the liberation of Europe, were slaughtered in the cold waters of the Rhine due to the catastrophic planning of British staff officers. By September 25, the brutal arithmetic of the battlefield could no longer be ignored. The 1st Airborne Division was facing total annihilation. Field Marshal Montgomery finally ordered Urquhart to abandon the Oosterbeek pocket and retreat across the river. The withdrawal, code-named Operation Berlin, was executed in the dead of night amidst a torrential downpour. The paratroopers wrapped their boots in torn blankets and parachute silk to muffle their footsteps. They had to leave their wounded behind in the cellars, tended to by volunteer medical officers and chaplains who chose to stay and face captivity. Canadian engineers from the 23rd Field Company brought up small canvas storm boats and began ferrying the exhausted survivors across the fast-flowing, 400-yard-wide river. The Germans, realizing what was happening, unleashed a massive artillery barrage on the crossing points. Men were blown out of the boats, drowning in the dark, freezing water just yards from safety. When dawn broke on September 26, the boats had to stop. Out of the roughly 10,000 men of the British 1st Airborne Division who had jumped into the Netherlands 9 days earlier, fewer than 2,400 made it back across the river. The division was functionally destroyed, its veteran corps wiped out in a single operation. How did an operation planned by some of the most experienced commanders in the Allied Expeditionary Force fail so spectacularly? We must analyze the multi-dimensional failures, starting with intelligence. The failure at Arnhem was not a lack of information, it was a willful refusal to accept reality. Allied intelligence possessed ultra-intercepts, the decrypted German Enigma radio traffic, which clearly indicated that the 2 SS Panzer Corps was refitting in the exact area the British were planning to drop. The Dutch resistance provided detailed reports of heavy armour. Major Brian Urquhart's aerial reconnaissance photographs explicitly showed German tanks hidden in the trees, yet the senior command staff dismissed all of it. This is a textbook example of confirmation bias. They wanted a daring airborne strike, and therefore any data that contradicted that desire was ignored. We saw this exact same catastrophic intelligence failure during the Tet Offensive in the Vietnam War in 1968. American military intelligence had numerous reports of massive Viet Cong troop movements and logistical build-ups. But the senior commander, wedded to the narrative that the enemy was severely degraded and incapable of a nationwide coordinated offensive, ignored the warnings. When commanders fall in love with their own operational timeline, intelligence becomes an annoyance to be swatted away rather than a tool for survival. Strategically, Market Garden violated the most fundamental principle of military engineering and logistics, which is the absolute necessity of redundancy. A 64-mile deep penetration offensive, relying entirely on a single, elevated, two-lane highway is not a military strategy. It is a high-wire act without a net. Hell's Highway was a single point of failure. If one bridge was blown, if one Sherman tank was destroyed and blocked the road, the entire multi-division corps ground to a halt. You cannot push the logistical tail of an entire armoured army up a single straw. The Germans did not need to defeat Executive Corps in a pitched battle. They simply had to cut the road behind them, which they did repeatedly, forcing the British vanguard to stop and wait for the supply lines to be reopened. From an economic and human capital perspective, the loss of the airborne forces was staggering. Airborne troops are elite, highly specialized assets. They require extensive training, specialized equipment, and massive logistical support. You cannot simply draft a farm boy from Iowa or a factory worker from London and turn him into a combat-ready paratrooper in 3 weeks. It takes months of physical conditioning and jump school. The loss of the 1st Airborne Division, along with the severe casualties suffered by the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, meant that the Allies flushed years of institutional knowledge and irreplaceable combat experience down the drain in a matter of days. Politically, the operation was driven by Field Marshal Montgomery's massive ego and his desire to beat General George Patton to the Rhine, combined with General Eisenhower's political need to appease his British allies and utilize the newly formed 1st Allied Airborne Army. Wars are never fought in a sterile vacuum of pure tactics. They are always compromised by the messy, blood-soaked reality of coalition politics. Operation Market Garden failed to secure a bridgehead over the Rhine. It failed to outflank the Siegfried Line. It failed to end the war by Christmas. Instead, it left the Allies holding a vulnerable 60-mile-long salient leading nowhere, bordered by swamps which required constant defense and drained vital resources. The bridge at Arnhem remained a bridge too far. The Allied momentum was shattered, and the front lines stabilized. The failure in the Netherlands guaranteed that the war would drag on into the freezing, brutal winter of 1944, setting the stage for the ultimate German counter-offensive in the Ardennes forest, known as the Battle of the Bulge. The friction of war does not care about the elegance of the plan on a map. It only respects the brutal arithmetic of logistics, terrain, and enemy resolve. Here is a question for you to answer in the comments below. What do you believe was the single biggest cause of the Market Garden failure? A. The single-road logistical bottleneck of Hell's Highway. B. The catastrophic intelligence failure regarding the German panzer divisions. The decision to British paratroopers 8 miles away from the Arnhem Bridge. Let me know your choice.